All right, welcome back, guys. So this is an exciting chapter or exciting module, really important. This is the what's the exercise that needs to be done to provoke weight loss. And so there's a lot here. Stick with me. Pause, go back, and rewatch if you want to. But this is obviously very key. And so let's get started. First, let's talk about mindset a little bit. So some people don't like exercise. Exercise is hard. But at the same time, uh, being obese and suffering from the complications of morbid obesity is also hard. I know that the picture that I have here might seem somewhat extreme with this guy on a ventilator, but nonetheless, this is for some people, this is reality. And so you have the option to make a choice. Are you going to choose to do the hard things that are required for you to achieve your weight loss goals, which includes exercise? Or are you going to choose the consequences, the health consequences of obesity? Think of what's going on right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that obese individuals suffer disproportionately from extreme symptoms of COVID. And so that's just one minor example, but you make your choice. And so hopefully you're making the choice of, I'm going to use my agency and act and not be acted upon, and I'm going to exercise. So with that, let's get into how much. So a lot of people believe that exercise by itself is not good for weight loss, because depending on how you do the exercise, that may be right. But the reason people do this is because they feel like if they follow the public health guidelines, then they should lose weight. The reality is you won't. What do I mean by this? Let's assume that I don't know, my mother or somebody wants to go walk a dog around the block. And she says, I'm going to exercise. I'm going to walk the dog around the block every single day, which she should do. But let's even assume she walks it around the block and it's a big block to where it's 30 minutes, which is the public health recommendation, 30 minutes a day, about 5 days a week. If we look at that, that's only about 200 calories a session. So if she does that 7 days a week, she's only burned 1,400 calories. And as we said, 3,500 calories is how much is in a pound. So she'd have to do this for 2 weeks and she still wouldn't have lost a single pound. The average female wants to lose 35% of their body weight. So in her mind, doing this for 3 weeks to get 1 pound is worthless. And so that simply what's going on here is we're not exercising enough. The public health guidelines were not created because of weight loss. The public health guidelines, the those who created these guidelines, what they had in their mind was how much exercise can we get Americans to do that will see a health benefit. A health benefit and a weight loss benefit are not the same thing. My mother walking her dog around the block for 30 minutes, 5 to 7 days a week, will definitely see health benefits. That's not going to induce any weight loss. Okay. And they had to do this. I mean, only 8% of the population even does this, anyways. And so why would they tell us to do more? So you got to note that. Um, One study proving my point, they looked at walking to see if walking can induce any sort of weight loss. And walking 30 minutes a day didn't do a darn thing. Now, once they got above 30 minutes, walking started to induce weight loss. Eventually, they needed 120 minutes a day to even see anything. Now, that's just walking. I don't think you don't need to exercise 2 hours a day, but that's through walking. So there definitely is a dose response. Let me show you a study that really highlighted this, and then we'll talk about how much is needed. So this was a landmark study that came out just to really assess how much volume of exercise is needed to be able to see any significant weight loss. And so they randomized about 180 subjects into 4 different groups. You had a control group that didn't do anything. Then you had a group that did a low amount of exercise at moderate intensity. Then you had a group that did low amount, but the intensity was much higher. And then you had the group that was the highest amount. They did a high amount of exercise and it was very vigorous. Okay. And they had them do this over the period of, I can't remember how many weeks now, I want to say 10 weeks, to see how much weight was lost and which group did better. And so this, if you can't see, this says the change in body weight as a percentage. And then down here we have the control group, low amount moderate, low amount vigorous, and high amount vigorous. Well, The control group didn't, nothing happened, obviously. Weight was lost in these two groups, but the group that lost the most amount of weight was the one that did the most amount of exercise. If we look at specifically fat mass, that's right here. Again, the group that lost the most amount of fat mass was the group that did the most amount of exercise. Lean body mass, it's really important. We want to preserve increased lean body mass. The group that increased, that's muscle mass the most, did the most amount of exercise. So dose response, one of the reasons, and when I say a dose response, think about it in relation to say caffeine. Let's say that you, I don't know, you need to increase peppiness. And so you say, I'm gonna have a Mountain Dew. Mountain Dew, I think, is nectar of the gods. It's amazing. And so you have one Mountain Dew, then maybe you feel a little bit more spunky. So for the dose of caffeine in that Mountain Dew, the response is I feel a little bit of pep. If you have 3 Mountain Dews, I've increased the dose, and then obviously the response will be increased. That's what we mean when we talk about dose response relationship. For exercise, really just do more. Now I'm going to make it a little more complicated than that, but if you can take anything from this, you need to do more. Now, one of the reasons is the goal of exercise is to burn fat, not to burn carbohydrate. Well, carbs are stored in a finite manner in our skeletal muscle, as we've stated. We can store maybe 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrates at any given time. Now, that's if our carbohydrate tank is all full. Well, the longer that you exercise, the more carbs become depleted because you use them for energy. What that does is it causes a shift to where instead of burning carbohydrates for fuel, we start to burn fats for fuel, which is the goal. To see that shift, we really need about 60 minutes of exercise. And so when we ask the question, okay, first, how much exercise should I do? The data is pretty compelling that 60 minutes or an hour a day, almost every day is needed. I always put 6 days a week. Your body does need some recovery. That's the amount of exercise you need. If you look at that and you feel like, well, I can't do that, you're not going to have success. You're not going to have long-term success. This is what's needed for weight loss. Anybody who has removed weight and kept it off for a long period of time, they engage in this amount of exercise. Now, once you lose the weight that you want, the data shows you don't need as much. To maintain weight, you can bring it down to 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week, which is a lot easier to do. So, I mean, if you get to your you do your hour a day every day and you get to your goal, then we can bring it back a little bit. All right, so first we've determined how much do we need? 60 minutes a day, 6 days a week. So now we move on to, well, what should that exercise consist of? We're going to start with cardio, and then we're going to go into resistance training. So if we look at cardio, there's really 2 schools of thought. We have what we call fat max training, and then we have what we call HIIT training. HIIT training has become very, very popular, so I'm sure that you all are familiar with it. But let's start with this concept of fat max training, about what this is and why this is proposed. So first we need to step back and say, well, what is the goal of the exercise session? Well, the goal of the exercise session is to favorably enhance metabolism. So we want to increase energy expenditure and to increase fat burning, not just for the exercise session, but for 24 hours. You have to think about the effects of the exercise session on 24-hour metabolism. If you don't do that, then it almost looks like exercise isn't going to do much for you. But if you look at it over a 24-hour period and what that session does, now it begins to do a lot in relation to weight maintenance. And so the goal of the session is to favorably affect 24-hour metabolism. The other goal, which I already said, is to increase fat burning, not carb burning. And so we need, again, nobody says, Zach, I want to lose 10 pounds of carb. Everyone says, I want to lose 10 pounds of fat. And so fat max, what it is the intensity of exercise that burns the greatest amount of fat. Let's look at some exercise physiology really quick. So aerobic power on the x-axis, all we're saying there is intensity. So you can even change it to say intensity. How hard am I working? And then if you look at the Y, we've got the percent of calories coming from fat. On this axis, we have the percent of calories coming from carb. You see the little key there. Let's look at fat, the non-dashed line, the solid line. At low intensities, really most of our energy is coming from fat. at lower intensities. As we increase intensity, so we start to work harder and harder and harder, the amount of calories coming from fat starts to go down. And we start to rely much more readily on carbohydrates for fuel. You do need to take this with a grain of salt, because even though, let's take at rest, well, at rest, you're about 60% of all your calories should be coming from fat. Well, that doesn't mean that you should never exercise then, right? So it is relative, it's a percentage. So 60% of 2 calories is not that much, because you're not burning that many calories at rest. So fat max is some sweet spot that's usually around this 50 to 60% of heart rate max. That is the intensity at which the body is burning the greatest amount of fat. Exercising at this intensity has shown to be very effective at reducing fat. This is one meta-analysis. Again, all these names are authors of different studies. And this is just looking at if you exercise at fat max, they're calling it maximum lipid oxidation, same thing. Can you induce weight loss? And they did. I mean, this is fat mass loss or fat loss. So yeah, it can be effective. And actually, it's been suggested that the amount of fat burned during exercise at the fat max intensity is 2 times greater than any other intensity. So this is an effective mode of weight loss. So where this is, if you're watching this and you don't exercise right now, we'd call you sedentary. I don't mean that in a negative term. It's just how we would have to classify you. Your fat max is achieved at about 55% of heart rate max. If you're watching this right now and you're someone that already engages in a lot of exercise, your fat max is anywhere between 65 to 75 or 65 to 70% of heart rate max. I'm going to ask you to start looking at your exercise and your heart rates and your RPEs, and we'll talk about RPE in a second. And so let's pause a little bit, talk about incorporating this. So what you're seeing here is a part of the planner in the 24-hour weight loss planner. And we have a section in here to log the HIIT training that you'll do, which we'll discuss here in a second, the fat max training that you'll do, and then eventually we'll talk about resistance training. So let's just look at fat max training. So we'll put the whole program together by the end of the lesson today. Right now, we're just talking about fat max training. Remember, it needs to be for 60 minutes. Now, when I say exercise modality, what that means is, are you going to be on a bike? Are you going to be on a treadmill? Are you going to be swimming? Are you going to be on a rower? You make a choice. Okay. Are you jogging? What are you doing? That's exercise modality. So let's say that I'm going to say bike. That's supposed to say bike. Sorry. Your goal intensity. Well, your goal intensity, we'll assume you're sedentary, is 55% of heart rate max. So how do we do that? Let's say you're 20 years old. So to get heart rate max, you go 220 minus age. If you're 20, your age is, if you're 20, then that comes to 200. That's beats per minute. So your heart rate max is 200 beats per minute. Well, fat max is 55% of that. So then we'll multiply that by 0.55. Whatever that comes out to be, 105 or something, I think, then that's going to be, no, I didn't do that right. Let me do the calculator here. You're saying you should know that. Yeah, I probably should. Let me make sure I'm right here. 110. So your goal is a heart rate of 110 beats per minute. So that would be your goal intensity, 110. And so we want to make sure that you're doing that. So you're going to monitor your heart rate every 10 minutes, and you're going to record whatever your heart rate is. And you won't be exact. I mean, and don't try to be exact. If I were doing this, I would try to be anywhere between 105 and 120. That's probably a pretty good range. Okay. So you should invest in a heart rate monitor. If you don't want to, I recommend you do. It's like a speedometer. I mean, I once had this old beat up truck and I loved it, and its speedometer didn't work. And so the only way I knew how hard I was working is I just had to look at everyone else on the street, right? How fast I was going. I mean, our heart rate's the speedometer for the body. We need to know how hard we're working. But if you don't want to get one, you can use what we call an RPE scale. An RPE scale is just a scale of from 1 to 10. There's different scales. And so you could use an RPE scale, but that's why we have RPE. It stands for rate of perceived exertion. But I get a heart rate monitor. They're so cheap. I mean, you should just invest in one. And a lot of the watches have them. The watch, just a side note, the wrist heart rate monitors are not very good during exercise. The ones that you wear like part of your watch, they're great if you're at rest. If you can get it to work, fine, do it. But really, you'd probably want a heart rate monitor. I like a polar monitor, and you wear it on your wrist. There's some that you can wear around your chest. A lot of different heart rate monitors, but you should get that. And so that's your fat max training. You do it for 60 minutes. Okay. We'll discuss more about how to incorporate that and with the other aspects of training once we get to talking about HIIT and other things. So the idea with fat max training is it's an intensity where you're burning a lot of fat, you've depleted carbs, and so this is prime fat burning time. But again, we want to think about exercise in a 24-hour period. And so we know that following exercise, our energy expenditure is increased. We also care about total fat burning throughout a whole day. So we want to know not just about the fat that's burned during exercise, but what did that exercise do so I can burn a lot of fat following exercise? So what we call this is EPOC. EPOC stands for excess post exercise oxygen consumption. It's a mouthful. That's why I just say EPOC. EPOC, so again, this is the amount of energy you're burning after exercise because of the exercise that you have done. So meaning maybe you're burning 5 calories sitting there doing nothing, 5 calories, let's say 5 calories a minute. And then you exercise. Now, hopefully you're burning 8 calories a minute because you had exercise. That's what EPOC is. EPOC's been highlighted as much more important than we used to think in relation to weight loss and weight management. So then the question arises, what type of exercise maximizes EPOC, provokes this really high fat and calorie burning after exercise? So here's the reference, but let's look at this. In this study, what these authors did is they took a group of young men and they had them exercise for 80 minutes at 30% of VO2 max, 50% of their max, and then 75% of their max. And they did this for 80 minutes. Then what they had them do is they had them come to the lab after they were at the lab, stay at the lab, and for 14 hours, they measured oxygen consumption. So that this makes sense. If I know oxygen, I know calories. So when someone says, oh, you're consuming more oxygen, you're burning more calories. That's how we measure calories. So EPOC is a volume measurement, the volume of oxygen that you consumed. If that goes up, you're burning more calories. What they found, and so each one of these shapes is a person in this figure that I'm showing. That's one person, that's one person, that's one, that's one, that's one, and that's one. And so first, let's go to 30%. That's where they started. They exercised for 80 minutes. That's a long time, but it was only 30%. On average, they really had essentially nothing. There was essentially no EPOC. So right now, what that means is if we want to maximize EPOC, low intensity is not going to do it. The exercise for 80 minutes, that's a lot. It's more than what I recommended you guys do, but it didn't do anything for EPOC. It's not until they got to, well, actually, let's look at 50% too. At 50%, now everyone responds differently. That's why we're seeing this spread. But the average response, if I'm taking the average of them, looks like it might have been 5 liters. 5 liters of oxygen is about 25 extra calories. Is that significant? Now that's extra calories, meaning they obviously burned a lot of calories during 80 minutes of exercise. But I'm saying now the added calories because of this EPOC, it was only 25 extra calories. I don't know. I feel like that's not that significant. It's not until, let me erase all these lines here. It's not until they got to 75% of max that we started to see something. Now, again, everyone's different. This poor guy here is never going to lose weight. This is the reality of genetics. This guy did the same thing as everyone else, and his EPOC was essentially nothing. But look at this guy. This guy had almost 50 liters. That's about 250 extra calories. So meaning he burned a ton of calories during the 80 minutes of exercise. And then on top of that, that's 250 calories extra because of the exercise that they did. In my mind, now we're getting somewhere, but it took higher intensity. Now, remember, when we talk about how exercise induces weight loss, we look at what it does to energy expenditure. Then the second question is, well, of these 250 calories, where did they come from? Did they come from carbohydrates or fats? Hopefully fats, right? So these researchers also measured this. Stick with me. I know this is kind of getting a little exercise physiology intense, but I want you to understand why we do the exercises that we do. So what they also measured is, so when we measure, let's go back here. When we measure EPOC, we're measuring oxygen consumption. That's what this is. They also measure CO2 production. Okay, in any research study like this, that's what they do. Well, if we take oxygen consumption and CO2 production, we get this ratio that we call the respiratory exchange ratio, or these authors are calling it the R value, which in essence is just telling you, are you burning carbs or are you burning fat? If this ratio is 1.0, it says you're burning carbs. If this ratio is 0.7, it says you're burning fat. Now we're usually in between. We're not one or the other, but this can give us an idea of what's going on. And so each of the lines, here's our key, represents a different intensity that they exercised at. During exercise, so if you see here, during exercise, the groups with the higher intensity was burning more carbohydrate. That's normal. The harder you work, the more carbs. Now, if you look at exercise as just the 30-minute session or 60-minute session, then you would look at this and say, well, then why would I ever do high intensity exercise? Why would I ever do that? Because you're burning more carbs. But you have to think of exercise as what the effects of that exercise does for a 24-hour period. After the exercise session, this group here, that's the high intensity, dropped and they stayed lower for about 11 hours. Lower means more fat, meaning the group that exercised at higher intensities, after exercise, they burned more fat for 11 hours than the groups that exercised at lower intensities. That's significant. That's really significant. But it took higher intensity exercise to do that. Now, what intensity do you need to be? Well, we know you have to be at least above 70% of heart rate max to have any sort of meaningful EPOC. You have to be at least above 70%. And it needs to be for at least 20 minutes. Okay. So now let's then, with that understanding of the EPOC, that's why HIIT training has been proposed. HIIT training is high intensity interval training. An example of HIIT training is from this study. This study did 10 sprints. So what they did is they did a sprint for about a minute. It wasn't quite a minute. The subjects sprinted as hard as they could, and then they walked for about a minute. And then they sprinted for a minute and walked for a minute. Sprinted for a minute, walked for a minute. They did this 10 times. That's HIIT training. What they also measured was adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And they found that after each sprint, these hormones went up each time. Guys, when these hormones go up, we increase energy expenditure. The hormonal response to this type of exercise is very effective for producing fat loss. Now, remember, yes, during the exercise of HIIT training, during the exercise, you're burning more carbs. But as we saw here, because you burn those carbs and because of the hormonal response, you now are burning more fats following the exercise training. And the data is pretty compelling, showing that this is effective. So here's just one study, and they compared the effects of HIIT training versus steady state exercise, where you'll just go at, say, 60% of your max for an hour. And they found that HIIT training was better at reducing total fat and abdominal fat. And there's a lot of data that shows this. In addition to HIIT training, possibly, and I'm not necessarily, well, we'll keep going. In addition to saying that HIIT training is better for EPOC, which it is, and fat utilization after exercise, there's also good evidence showing that appetite is reduced. And so when you look, a lot of the research where they look at HIIT training and people lost weight, a lot of the researchers think it's probably because when you do a high intensity exercise, and you have these hormones released that you don't really want to eat. It curbs appetite. And so that's a benefit here. Appetite's been shown to be reduced following maximum exercise. Thus, HIIT training may be effective because of this. And so now we have a second form of cardio called HIIT training. And now we return here. Now, as you notice, I have a spot for both. I'm not saying one is better than the other. Both are necessary. So when we look at our HIIT training, again, you'll fill out your exercise modality. Do you want to do this sprinting? Do you want to do it on a treadmill? Do you want to do it on a bike? Do you want to do it on a rower? Do you want to do it on an elliptical? Choose any cardio machine that you want to do. Okay. For HIIT, I always feel like it's easiest on a bike or on a treadmill. It's easier that way for me. You can do it however you want. You need to then choose your goal intensity. So your goal intensity needs to be 85. You need to be above 85% of your max. So again, 220 minus age. Let's say I'm 20 years old. So that'd be 200. And then for this, you want to multiply it by 0.85. That's going to be your goal heart rate intensity. And then after each interval, you need to record your heart rate. Now, if you've done this before, you probably won't quite be at your goal heart rate after the first 3 intervals. But you'll get there. You want it to where you eventually get to your goal heart rate, hopefully at least by mid HIIT training session. Now, there are so many different ways that you can do HIIT training. There's tons of different models. I've outlined one that I think is very effective and easier for a lot of people to do. This is what's called a 10 by 1, meaning you're doing 10 intervals at 1 minute each. So you do 1 minute on. So during 1 minute on, and then you'll hopefully get your heart rate, right? After you get done with that, you'll write your heart rate. Let's say that it's 150, and then you'll do 1 minute off. And that's just when you're off, you're just active recovery. So let's say I'm sprinting on a treadmill. I'm sprinting on a treadmill for a minute. Oh, I get done. I write my heart rate down while I'm walking. I'm walking for a minute. And then I sprint for a minute. And then I get done, I write my heart rate down, and then I'm walking. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about this HIIT training session. If you have questions on any of this, again, send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So which one's better? Is HIIT training better than FatMax? I've shown you 2 different ways to do cardio, and both seem very appealing. And the answer is neither is better, really. Here is a meta-analysis asking this question: which one really is better? And so if we look at just up here, they're looking at, okay, can HIIT training induce fat loss? And this diamond being on the left side of the line says, yeah, it's effective at doing that. And now all of these studies say, okay, can lower intensity, more like FatMax training, induce fat loss? And then again, it does. And then all of these studies say which one's better. And if you notice that that diamond is right there in the middle line, meaning neither is better. Neither is better. And so the program calls for you to do both. I don't know why we always have to think that there's one competing for the other. You want to do both of them. I just noticed that I've been talking for a while. I'm going to stop here. This is part 1. And then we're going to make a part 2 of the video. So let me stop.